What if I told you the part of you that never settled, never stopped hoping, even when you had every reason to give up, wasn't being naive, it was being prophetic? What if your resistance to lack, your quiet refusal to believe that scraps were all you'd ever know, was actually proof that heaven had already whispered a different story into your spirit? You felt it, didn't you? Even in your driest seasons, something inside you said, there has to be more than this. Not because you were greedy, but because you were wired for glory. See, before this world taught you how to perform for crumbs, heaven had already prepared a table with your name etched into it. And now, right now, something sacred is shifting. Not around you, but within you. The version of you that stayed faithful when no one clapped, that chose silence over spectacle, surrender over striving, that version is rising. And it's not rising to compete, it's rising to receive. This isn't another hype reel, it's not spiritual fluff. This is alignment. And the wealth that's coming, it isn't a prize, it's a signal that your becoming has been witnessed. And the delay? It was never rejection, it was holy construction. So before we dive deeper, pause for just a second. Seal this moment. If your spirit already knows this message wasn't randomly scrolling into your life, type 777 in the comments, not just as a number, but as a declaration. It is time. I am ready. I receive what was written for me. Because this next part, it's going to reveal why you weren't overlooked. You were hidden, and now the unveiling begins. Let's go. Heaven's been waiting. God's chosen ones. God is about to make you rich. No one saw it coming. This is not about hustle, and it's never been about trying to earn what was already yours by design. You were not called to survive by exhausting yourself, but to be sustained by divine resonance. In the economy of heaven, the real you, not the curated version, not the role you had to play, is the one being funded now. Not the performance, but the presence. Not the imitation, but the incarnation of truth. And isn't that what always separated you, even in silence? You chose the narrow road that demanded surrender instead of strategy. The path that never promised applause, but always required alignment. Matthew 7:14 says, "But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." You found it, and stayed when it was lonely. You're not being elevated because you learned how to play the game. You're being remembered because you had the courage to walk away from it. Platforms courted your talent, but rejected your truth, yet you never bartered the sacred for visibility. Like Moses, who left the palaces of Egypt for a wilderness he couldn't explain, you too rejected counterfeit crowns. Hebrews 11:26 reminds us, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Why is it then that now, without credentials, without viral traction, without sponsors, you're being positioned for overflow? How do you explain a life that's glowing with provision when no formula or 5-step funnel was ever followed? Could it be that heaven was always the silent architect, drafting your name into a blueprint no algorithm could delete? Remember what Jesus said in John 15:5, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." What you're carrying now isn't a reward for performance, it's a divine endorsement of identity. When God pays you, the currency isn't hourly, it's holy. Favor that bypasses bureaucracy, positioning that overrides protocol, anointing that creates gravitational access where walls once stood. Isaiah 22:22 affirms this. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. They'll whisper, they'll question, they'll ask how you did it without hustling, how you opened doors without pushing, how you held influence without manufacturing relevance. But they won't understand that your stillness was strategic, not passive. You waited when everything screamed to move. You stayed hidden when the spotlight beckoned. And in that silence, something unshakable was forged. Psalm 46:10 echoes the blueprint of your spirit. Be still and know that I am God. You watched them race ahead while your soul sat in the shadows. You didn't skip steps. You simply honored the process. You surrendered the grind culture, not because you feared hard work, but because you no longer wanted to chase what your spirit had already inherited. In a world obsessed with metrics, you chose mystery. In a generation chasing likes, you chased light. And now the reward is catching up. It's like how certain trees, like the bristlecone pine, grow slowly in high-altitude deserts, becoming the oldest and most enduring life forms on Earth. While flashier trees grow fast and fall in storms, you were built by divine ecology. Slowly, deeply, intentionally. What's being birthed now was never meant to be rushed. Ecclesiastes 3:11 declares, "He has made everything beautiful in its time." And stories like yours were never meant to go viral. They were meant to be vital. Have you noticed how the ones who rise with flash often fall without foundation? How the ones who shout the loudest often hide the weakest structures? Could it be that your silence was your sanctuary and your patience the scaffolding for something heaven alone could sponsor? The world applauded the builders of empires, but heaven remembered the guardians of truth. Think of Dorothy Day, a journalist turned activist who gave up notoriety to live among the poor. She never chased wealth, but her legacy became a spiritual economy. On the other hand, Elizabeth Holmes, once hailed as a visionary in biotech, built her platform on deception. Her fall wasn't just public, it was prophetic. It revealed what happens when ambition outruns integrity. And then there are stories people haven't heard, like Mateo, a street violinist in Lisbon who refused to fake virtuosity for popularity. He practiced alone for years in tunnels, declining every producer that wanted him to modernize his soul. Today, strangers fund his concerts simply because his sound breaks through their noise. No brand, no platform, just resonance. This is your Mateo moment, your Dorothy Day moment. Not a return to performance, but a revealing presence. You gave up chasing validation, and heaven, quietly, fiercely, has written your name into an inheritance no market collapse or social algorithm could block. You didn't just avoid burnout, you dismantled the whole idea that worth must be earned through exhaustion. You are not a product of grind, you are a revelation of grace. This was never just about income, this is about impact, the kind that ripples through time, touches generations, and leaves traces on souls, not just spreadsheets. The kind of legacy no paycheck can measure and no resume can define. You weren't preserved to get paid, you were refined to shift dimensions. Because while the world saw stagnation, God saw strategy. Only heaven knows the hidden cost of your survival. How many nights did you cry and still show up with grace the next day? How many times did you get overlooked, not because you lacked substance, but because you didn't play small to make others comfortable? Luke 8:17 says, "For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open." And now the unveiling is happening, not just of your gifts, but of your story. There were entire seasons where celebration skipped your name. You clapped for others while your own arms were empty. You cheered while your own soul quietly wondered, when will it be me? But even in invisibility, you chose integrity. Even in silence, you honored your assignment. Isn't it strange how the ones who do the most spiritual heavy lifting are often the most hidden? Could it be that God kept you hidden not to punish you, but to protect the seed before the harvest? Like certain deep space stars, whose light hasn't reached earth, not because they're dim, but because they dwell in distances too vast for immediate recognition. You were never absent, only ahead of your time. The laws of astrophysics remind us light travels, but it needs the right atmospheric clarity to be seen. And now the spiritual conditions are aligning, the frequency is matching, the veil is lifting. Isaiah 61 declares, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you." Your light was never dim. It was preserved for Kairos timing, God's divine appointment. You weren't being overlooked, you were being constructed. The architecture of your inner world was being reinforced with beams of resilience and foundations of truth. Ephesians 2:21 affirms, "In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord." And what God was building wasn't a moment, it was a movement. While others sprinted toward visibility, you were being anchored for sustainability. You didn't miss your window, you became the window. The access point through which others will now find healing, perspective, and power. During this divine dormancy, you were like the baobab tree, known for growing in silence beneath the earth for years before emerging with a strength so expansive it defies drought. In ecology, this is called delayed emergence, a process where roots deepen while the surface remains still. That was you, growing without spectacle, stretching beneath storms no one saw. What if your invisibility was actually insulation? Take the example of Fred Rogers, yes, Mr. Rogers, the soft-spoken television icon who resisted glamour and chose depth. While networks demanded sensationalism, he stayed loyal to kindness and emotional literacy. Critics called him boring, but today, psychologists cite his work as foundational in child development and emotional intelligence. His quiet consistency became a national sanctuary. In stark contrast, televangelist Jim Bakker rose quickly with flash and empire, but ignored the inner scaffolding of character. His public collapse wasn't just moral, it became symbolic of what happens when charisma outruns consecration. He lost not only influence, but trust, and trust is the rarest currency of all. Meanwhile, stories like Yelena's remain mostly untold, a midwife in Eastern Europe who quietly delivered over 4,000 babies, many in war zones, never charging a cent to women in crisis. She lived alone, with no platform, just unwavering compassion. Decades later, those children have built schools, hospitals, and families shaped by her invisible care. Her name was never trending, but her legacy now pulses in the lives of thousands. And what about you? Could it be that your hidden years were really sacred architecture, God's way of reinforcing your soul before releasing your influence? How many times did you almost quit, but grace caught you by the collar of your purpose? How many internal battles did you win when no one even knew you were at war? Romans 8:18 says, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." And that glory, it's beginning to shine through now, like light long held in suspension, finally breaking the horizon. You weren't invisible. You were calibrated for the atmosphere of destiny, and now that the alignment is here, nothing can stop what heaven already approved. And now that it has arrived, the glow can no longer be hidden. It's not loud, but it's luminous. It doesn't ask for attention, yet it commands reverence. What people once misunderstood as stagnation was actually sacred stillness. A divine pause, engineered not to break you, but to build load-bearing strength into your spirit. You weren't behind, you were being undergirded. The stillness wasn't silence, it was structural reinforcement. Isaiah 28:16 reminds us, "Behold, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who believes will never be shaken." And that's exactly what God was doing with you. Laying a foundation deep enough to hold not just your blessings, but the weight of your calling. They thought you were idle. But what if the delay was divine design? What if the drought was teaching you how to find oxygen in the unseen? How to move not from need, but from knowing? How to stand in rooms without adjusting your essence, just to belong? You were learning to breathe without begging. Like a freediver plunging into unknown depths, your lungs, your capacity to trust, were being stretched to endure without noise, without applause. You were learning the sacred skill of interior oxygenation, drawing power from the presence of God when external validation was absent. And now you're being called forth as that version of yourself. Not the filtered one, not the socially optimized one, but the aligned, whole, scarred but soft version. The you that didn't fracture under fire, even when the flames licked at everything you built. 1 Peter 1:7 speaks to this. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. And you, yes you, came out refined, not resentful. The world offered you many trades, attention for authenticity, applause for obedience, survival for submission. You said no, even when it cost you your platform, even when it meant walking alone. You became the kind of soul heaven could trust, because you weren't for sale. You became light that didn't need a spotlight. You became proof that wholeness is wealth. And here's the mystery no one teaches you in hustle culture. Heaven never deposits where vessels are cracked. It waits, silently, until you're whole enough to hold what won't crush your character. That's why it felt like nothing was happening, because God was waiting for the structure of your soul to match the scale of His blessing. John 3:27 says, "A person can receive only what is given them from heaven. You couldn't manipulate it. You couldn't perform for it. You had to become the kind of person who could carry it." This wasn't a delay. It was divine engineering. In neuroscience, there's a term called neural pruning, the brain's process of eliminating synaptic connections that no longer serve you. Spiritually, that's what you've undergone. You weren't being punished. God was pruning every survival instinct, every applause addiction, every fear-based reflex, until only the authentic, unshakable you remained. You didn't just survive lean seasons. You survived the urge to shrink in order to fit, and that may be the rarest form of obedience, to remain fully yourself when every system rewards pretense. Take the story of Madeleine, a Parisian perfumer who refused to dilute her formulas to fit market trends. For 17 years, she sold almost nothing, until one royal client discovered her scent and made it a global signature. Her fragrance, now protected in glass cases across the world, was once mocked for being too pure to sell. But purity always finds its moment. Compare that to Adam Neumann, the former CEO of WeWork, who gained billions overnight by selling illusion. But when the cracks of inauthenticity showed, the fall wasn't gradual, it was devastating, because wealth gained without alignment is a structural hazard. What good is expansion if your integrity can't carry the weight of it? And heaven never builds with compromised blueprints. Meanwhile, your blueprint was being redrawn by divine architects. Your spirit now radiates a frequency the world can't manufacture. It carries the calm of someone who no longer needs to impress. It carries the power of someone who knows the difference between real and performative peace. You are no longer a chameleon. You are a constant. Psalm 37:9 affirms, "For those who wait on the Lord, they will inherit the land." You waited, not just for a breakthrough, but for the becoming required to sustain it. And now, wealth is not coming to impress you, it's coming to join you, because what's been formed in you is now strong enough to hold what no vault can contain. This is the kind of wealth that feels like breathing, natural, involuntary, encoded into your rhythm. It doesn't come through frantic chasing or manipulative negotiation. It arrives in resonance with your alignment. It doesn't ask you to negotiate your peace or trade your soul. It doesn't wake you in the middle of the night with fear. it lets you rest. This is covenant wealth, the kind that doesn't just fill your hands but restores your nervous system. It doesn't come as a transaction, it comes as a testimony. Proverbs 10:22 declares, "The blessing of the Lord brings wealth without painful toil for it, not without discipline, not without process, but without the torment of self-betrayal." It's not the kind of abundance that demands you become unrecognizable just to access it. This is the wealth that says you don't have to contort, you don't have to perform, you're safe now. And that kind of safety, that internal exhale, isn't possible when your identity is tied to your output. It only comes when your essence and your expression finally agree. Why would heaven give you overflow while you're still living from depletion? Why would favor fall on a fractured version of you when the real you is the only one it was always meant for? Could it be that God delayed it not to punish you, but to preserve your wholeness? Romans 5:6 says, "You see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." That principle of divine timing didn't end at the cross. It continues in your calling. The reward does not arrive early. It arrives when your nervous system can hold rest without guilt. It arrives when your soul no longer craves applause to feel alive. Right now, something is shifting. You can feel it in the ether, in the quiet hum between heaven and earth, like a storm building in the deep ocean before the waves ever reach the shore. The air is thick with prophetic electricity. The pressure is mounting, but it's not anxiety. It's expectancy. Psalm 126:5 whispers to your timeline, "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy." And that season of weeping, it's turning. The harvest is emerging, not because you forced it, but because you became it. It's the same kind of tension that builds in the atmosphere before tectonic plates realign. The crust doesn't shatter loudly, but the consequences are undeniable. The shift beneath your life is subtle, but it will reconfigure everything above it. A young woman named Farah once walked away from a lucrative advertising career when she realized she was selling ideals she no longer believed in. For years, she worked in obscurity, helping single mothers access housing, living paycheck to paycheck. Today, she leads a global initiative that's funded by philanthropists, not because she campaigned, but because someone quietly observed her faithfulness and wrote a check she never asked for. She didn't go viral. She went deep. And from the depth, God built a platform. Isn't it true that some of the most powerful shifts in your life happened when no one was clapping? Contrast that with Charles Ponzi, the namesake of the Ponzi scheme, who lured people with fake promises of fast return. His empire grew quickly but collapsed violently. What appears overnight without root will rot under pressure. What glows without integrity always combusts. You didn't rush. You didn't inflate. You inhaled when it hurt. You exhaled when no one saw. You practiced what psychology calls embodied regulation, training your nervous system to trust stillness, to sit with discomfort, to stay present without collapsing. You became an atmosphere before you ever entered one. Now the atmosphere has finally caught up to your frequency. This isn't emotional hype. It's quantum resonance, the vibrational alignment between who you are and what's arriving. And when the spotlight finally turns toward you, will you recognize that it's not validation, it's confirmation? 2 Corinthians 3:2-3 captures this mystery. You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. You've become the message. You're not waiting for validation. You are the evidence. Your rest is no longer passive. It's becoming prophetic. The stillness you cultivated in private is about to speak louder than any stage you were once denied. Your rest is becoming the revelation people didn't know they were waiting for. And your peace? It's now irrefutable proof. Proof that a soul aligned with heaven needs no hype to be holy. Because when God funds a life, He doesn't just provide resources, He releases radiance. A frequency that no marketing strategy can imitate, no branding campaign can fake, and no influencer can replicate. Isaiah 30:15 says, "In repentance and rest is your salvation, in quietness and trust is your strength." That wasn't a metaphor, it was a blueprint. You weren't lazy, you were trusting, and now the glow that surrounds you isn't charisma, it's clarity. The era of performing is being closed. The era of proving is being buried. What's rising now is the season of receiving, not for who you pretended to be, but for who you never stopped being, even when it cost you everything. You're stepping into a realm where blessings don't arrive as wages, they arrive as witnesses. Have you ever noticed how peace unsettles people who only understand productivity? What if your stillness is the sign they couldn't decode? Could it be that your quiet obedience was louder in heaven than the noisy ambition of others? When the shift begins, it won't feel like a transaction. It will feel like a cosmic recognition, a nod from heaven saying, "You didn't compromise, you didn't collapse, you didn't contort, you stayed rooted." And now, the soil beneath your soul is opening. Hosea 10:12 echoes this moment. "Break up your unplowed ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, until He comes and showers His righteousness on you." The field you sowed in faith is responding, not to your striving, but to your stillness. Your seed has found its atmosphere. This isn't provision for rent or survival. This is resource tied directly to your remnant DNA. It's not just money, it's meaning. It's not just opportunity, it's orchestration. The wealth being released isn't external compensation, it's spiritual convergence. One man named Elias, a reclusive horticulturist in the Azores, cultivated a forgotten species of orchid in silence for over 22 years. No press, no business model, no social presence, just daily tending. That one flower now funds a global conservation project because it contains a scent compound impossible to manufacture. The world had to catch up to what he protected in secret. Meanwhile, in contrast, Sam Bankman-Fried, once hailed as a crypto visionary, created an empire built on artificial trust. His collapse was a warning. What looks like brilliance without rooted ethics is just performance under pressure. And performance always breaks. Now the shift may feel strange. Ease begins to displace the chronic tension you've normalized for years. Rooms open, not because you campaigned for them, but because they recognize your frequency. You're not kicking down doors anymore. Doors are recognizing your design. Isn't it wild how provision shows up fastest when you stop trying to earn it and just allow it to arrive? Ecclesiastes 2:26 reminds us, "To the person who pleases Him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, He gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God." That transfer is not just economic, it's energetic. You are receiving what was held up because your soul is finally still enough to hold it. And when provision shows up before pressure even knocks, you'll know it wasn't bribery, it was confirmation that you were always enough, that heaven was never late, and that faithfulness always finds its form. This wealth doesn't just solve problems, it rewrites blueprints. It enters your life not to patch leaks, but to rebuild the structure from a place of overflow rather than survival. You're not just receiving things, you're receiving restoration. It's the difference between renting favor and owning inheritance. You used to think provision was something you had to strive to deserve. Now you're learning it's something that recognizes the frequency of your integrity. This is not about being impressive. This is about being true. Because when truth settles in your bones, resources start flowing not toward performance, but toward presence. In the field of architecture, there's a concept called load path integrity. It refers to how force travels from the rooftop all the way down to the foundation. If any beam is misaligned, the whole structure becomes unstable. That's why God refused to build your wealth until you were aligned, not just morally, but emotionally, spiritually, even neurologically. Now, your soul has become that path, and heaven is placing weight, not to crush, but to confirm. In a small coastal town, a violin maker named Giancarlo spent decades making instruments no one could afford. He refused to cut corners. Some called him foolish. Some said he'd die unknown. But one day, a composer stumbled upon one of his violins in a dusty music shop and wept while playing it. That sound, crafted in obscurity, became the signature of a film that touched millions. The violin wasn't sold. It was honored. Your life is like that instrument. Years of tension stretched across your soul like strings, tuned silently by suffering and sanctification. And now the composer is ready to play. You've been carved, shaped, and hollowed out, not to be empty, but to resonate. Every disappointment was a tuning. Every delay was an alignment of pitch. You weren't being ignored. You were being crafted. And now, heaven's hand is reaching for you, not to fix you, but to use you. What if the tension wasn't resistance, but readiness? Maybe what you called pain was actually preparation. Maybe the pressure wasn't punishment, but precision, pulling you into key, stretching your soul into harmony with divine timing. When a string is tightened, it risks snapping, but in the hands of a master, that tension becomes tone. Could it be that you're finally in tune? Psalm 18:19 declares, "He brought me out into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me." God isn't giving you wealth out of obligation. He's doing it out of delight. He's not blessing you to reward your effort. He's blessing you because your essence has become aligned with his joy. A spacious place isn't just about physical expansion. It's emotional and spiritual capacity. You're no longer surviving tight spaces. You're inhabiting divine largeness. And no, this doesn't mean the road ahead is without resistance. But the resistance is no longer internal. It's not self-doubt. It's not self-betrayal. What once warred within you has now made peace. And that inner stillness is now your greatest authority. Your war was never with people. It was with your own permission to be powerful. And now that you've silenced the inner sabotage, outer conflict no longer has control. Stillness is no longer your avoidance. It's your strategy. You now carry a kind of quiet that unsettles the enemy because it cannot be manipulated. That's why this wealth can't be stolen. It wasn't built on visibility. It was built on vibrational truth. And no enemy can reverse what was built through resonance. This kind of abundance has no passwords, no platforms. It's coded in your spirit. It vibrates on frequencies higher than performance and beyond reach of attack. What was forged in stillness cannot be dismantled by spectacle. This is wealth that was woven into your becoming. Can you feel it? The shift from chasing to carrying, from effort to embodiment. This isn't emotional, it's energetic. Your body knows the shift before your mind can name it. You don't need to run anymore because what you once chased is now resting in your atmosphere. You've stopped reaching outward, and heaven is now rising inward. God didn't want to fund your brand. He wanted to fund your becoming. And now that you've become, the floodgates are opening, not chaotically, but coherently. You were never called to build a persona. You were called to become a vessel. And vessels don't audition. They contain. The floodgates aren't random. They're rhythmic. God doesn't just pour where it's empty. He pours where it's ready. And now that you're no longer striving to convince, the miracle is no longer being delayed. It's a dwelling. You are no longer asking for miracles. You are housing them. Because for the longest time, you believed that worth had to be earned through depletion. You internalized a theology of labor where usefulness equaled love. You became fluent in exhaustion, speaking the language of doing instead of being. You knew how to perform for applause, how to stay busy to avoid feeling invisible. Like many trauma survivors, you mistook overfunctioning for favor and burnout for belonging. But that season is ending. This chapter is not about sacrificial visibility, it's about sovereign validity. You're being seen without bleeding for it. You're being supported without submission. You're being loved without shrinking into a version of yourself that was easier to digest. Galatians 5:1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." This includes the invisible yokes, the emotional labor, the chronic overgiving, the spiritual guilt that tells you love must be earned through self-erasure. What if your enoughness was never meant to be proven, but simply embodied? This is not the season of just enough. This is the arrival of more than enough. Not because you chased it with strategy, but because you became the kind of soul that could hold abundance without drowning in ego. You don't need wealth to compensate for wounds anymore. You've been healed in the places where lack used to echo. Isaiah 61:7 affirms your transition. Instead of your shame, you will receive a double portion, and instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And that inheritance isn't just spiritual. It's emotional, financial, territorial. It's showing up in every place you once felt forgotten. Could it be that rest is a form of resistance against every system that tried to monetize your pain? You've been entrusted with the weight of others' pain, and now heaven is entrusting you with joy. Why? Because you didn't become cynical. You didn't weaponize your wounds. You didn't let bitterness calcify your compassion. Dr. Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist, once said, "Your pain is not your identity. Your choices, not your trauma, determine your future." That's what you've done. You made choices that turned pain into portals, grief into grace. And that's what separates you from those who manipulate pain instead of mending it. Take Jordan Belfort, the infamous Wolf of Wall Street. He didn't build wealth through wisdom. He built it through exploitation. He spotted people's insecurities and sold them dreams laced with deception. Underneath the bravado was a hollow empire sustained by addiction, manipulation, and ego. His fall wasn't just financial, it was spiritual. Because when success is built on seduction rather than substance, collapse is inevitable. And yes, you were sent to broken places. You carried light into environments that didn't even know they were dark. You showed up in jobs, churches, homes, relationships, not to extract, but to heal. And now you're being sent to beautiful ones. Not because you demanded comfort, but because beauty finally recognizes your frequency. In physics, phase transition is when matter changes state, like ice melting into water. Not because it tries harder, but because the environment shifts. That's what's happening in your life. You're not trying harder, you're just in phase now. Psalm 34 verse 5 says, "Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame." That radiance is showing up in you, not as aesthetic but as evidence. But not everyone will understand this shift. They'll look for formulas. They'll try to replicate what was never manufactured. They'll ask you for links, for tools, for shortcuts. What app did you use? What funnel? What coach flipped the switch? They want a button. But what's happening in you was never about buttons. It was about becoming. Isn't it strange how the people who once ignored you now want to decode your glow? Anna Delvey, a socialite who faked her way into New York's elite by posing as a German heiress. She gained access to luxury spaces, but built her entire empire on illusion. The moment the truth caught up, it all crumbled. Fraud charges, prison, public disgrace. Her story wasn't just a fall, It was a warning. Attention without authenticity leads to implosion. Meanwhile, someone like Nandita, a grocery store cashier in a small town in Kerala, India, spent 17 years quietly helping women in abusive marriages rebuild their lives, without a spotlight, without a title. When a journalist finally discovered what she had been doing, the town crowdfunded her first women's shelter. She didn't post about it, she embodied it. Impact didn't chase her, it found her. You didn't flip a switch, you let God rebuild your system. You didn't chase a quick breakthrough, you allowed a slow, sacred process to undo what trauma taught and rebuild what truth required. Instead of forcing your life into a formula, you surrendered to a rhythm only heaven understood. And now, every structure in your life, your values, your voice, your vision, has been realigned from the inside out. That's why what's coming will last. Because it's not built on noise, but on neural renewal and spiritual foundation. Ecclesiastes 8:6 reveals the hidden logic of your journey. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighed down by misery. There was a method in the silence, a choreography in the chaos. Even when it felt like nothing was moving, heaven was conducting something beneath the surface. The delays were divine design, not punishment. That misery you carried was often misdiagnosed by others, but it was really the weight of preparation wrapped in patience. And now that time has arrived. What once crushed you is now your credibility. You don't speak from theory, you speak from trenches. What used to make you tremble now makes you trustworthy. The very battles that nearly ended you are the ones that now authorize you. Heaven doesn't erase the scars, it turns them into seals. And people won't just listen to you because you're polished, they'll follow you because you're proven. What if the weight that nearly buried you is now the foundation that makes you immovable? The heaviness wasn't random, it was architectural. God was laying something in you that pressure alone could activate. You weren't being buried, you were being anchored. And now, when the winds of culture shift, you remain, because you're no longer standing on approval, but on assignment. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. 2 Corinthians 4:17. What you carry can't be reverse engineered. It's not a product, it's a presence. There's no manual for becoming what you've become. No one can replicate the oil that was pressed from your perseverance. You are not a brand or a strategy. You are a living testimony. The atmosphere shifts when you walk in, not because of performance, but because of proven weight. You're not what happened to you. You are what heaven formed through what happened. But they won't find a formula, because this blessing wasn't downloaded from an online course or summoned by a marketing funnel. It didn't come from branding, batching, or performance metrics. It came from maintenance, from soul work done in silence, from daily obedience when nothing changed, from choosing love when you had every reason to self-protect. You maintained faith when the atmosphere around you screamed fear. You maintained character when your reputation was attacked. You held integrity like an anchor in the middle of cultural drift. You didn't let the wilderness distort your theology or corrupt your discernment. That's why it's flowing now. Not just finances, but clarity, confirmation, favor without fatigue. James 1:12 says, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised." You weren't just enduring, you were qualifying. Could it be that the very seasons you resented were the classrooms heaven used to certify your capacity? This wealth doesn't come with strings. It doesn't demand compromise. It doesn't whisper conditions under the table. It doesn't ask you to perform or shapeshift or charm your way into doors that were never yours to force open. Because this isn't a wage, it's not compensation, it's a testament. Psalm 37:4 affirms this. "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." But now you understand. He wasn't giving you whatever you wanted. He was shaping your desires until they could be trusted. And here's the real proof. You don't feel frantic. You're not anxiously clenching for outcomes. You're calm. You're available. You're anchored. That calmness, that's a new frequency of receiving. In quantum physics, they call this coherence. When all internal systems align to allow a clean, energetic exchange. You're not leaking energy anymore. You've been sealed. Sometimes receiving doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives like a mist, quiet, subtle, undeniable. A knowing that the war has turned, that the long drought has finally cracked, and rain isn't just falling, it's forming rivers that don't stop halfway. What if the stillness you once feared was actually the signal that you were stepping into supernatural security? This is when heaven begins to sponsor your rest. You're no longer hustling for breakthrough. You are being carried by what you've already become. Peace is no longer a practice, it's your posture. You're not being paid to perform. You're being honored for what you carry, not the mask, not the edited version, but the essence. You're being rewarded for who you were when no one was clapping, for the light you nurtured when the world mocked your glow, for the truth you preserved in secret rooms where lies were rewarded. That's the version of you heaven is funding. A woman named Clarice, an aging hospice nurse in rural France, spent 30 years sitting at the bedsides of the dying, many of whom had no family. She prayed with them, cried with them, wrote their last words by hand. No salary could match her soul's currency. One day, the son of a woman she sat with anonymously transferred enough to fund her dream, a farm-turned-sanctuary for end-of-life care. No social media, no appeal, just legacy that returned to its source. Meanwhile, Billy McFarland, the infamous organizer of the fraudulent Fire Festival, sold people a luxury dream he never had the character to sustain. The result? International humiliation, criminal charges, years in prison. Why? Because charisma without integrity is a time bomb. It doesn't just collapse, it explodes. You, on the other hand, weren't busy trying to impress. You were busy preserving the flame in the cave of contradiction. And now, that flame is turning into overflow, into visible impact, into rooms you didn't have to audition for, into provision you didn't have to justify. Isn't it wild how heaven funds what the world ignored? Now, you're not chasing, you're carrying, and what you carry can't be bought, replicated, or rebranded. It's sacred, it's slow-built, it's real, and it's ready. Overflow like this doesn't just fill your cup, it redefines the container. It stretches the shape of your capacity, not to overwhelm you, but to reveal how much space your obedience carved out in the unseen. This isn't abundance that leaves you breathless and scrambling. It's the kind that fits you because it was formed within you first. Ephesians 3:20 whispers the math of this moment. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. The more didn't come from outside. It emerged from within, through power that was working, building, refining, long before the evidence showed up. That's why you don't feel imposter syndrome anymore. You're not trying to match a version of yourself you sold to survive. You're no longer calculating your value through the lens of other people's metrics. You're aligned. And alignment cancels anxiety. Could it be that peace is the loudest proof that you're finally operating in your true dimension? This is overflow that overflows into others. It's not tight-fisted or territorial. It multiplies because it moves through vessels that don't hoard. That's why God could trust you with it. You don't serve mammon, you steward mysteries. A schoolteacher named Marta, who taught underfunded inner-city classrooms for over 25 years, used her weekends to teach homeless teenagers how to write poetry and tell their stories. She never asked for recognition, but one of her students, now a best-selling author, named an entire literacy foundation after her. The overflow didn't just return, it reverberated. That's what your light is doing now. It's reverberating into places you forgot you even poured into. This is what heaven calls compound redemption, where not only are the years restored, but their ripple effect multiplies. What you sowed in tears is now producing fruit in places you never planted directly. Isn't it humbling that your invisible integrity is producing visible inheritance? That's why there's no rush, no panic, because you understand now, the reward was never just about resources. It was always about resonance. And when your spirit matches the sound of heaven, what's meant for you doesn't just arrive. It recognizes you. The wealth you're walking into now is the byproduct of that recognition, not a reaction, not a performance, not a transaction, but a holy acknowledgement of who you chose to be when no one was watching. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Matthew 6:6. And that kind of blessing can't be undone, because it wasn't built on strategy, it was built on substance. You're now stepping into opportunities that feel like alignment, not assignments you have to muscle through. There's no dread in your yes, no fragmentation in your acceptance. The doors opening to you now are not obligations, they're orchestrations. You don't have to shrink to fit them, you simply stand in them. And they recognize you because they were shaped by the same frequency you cultivated in silence. Provision is showing up like destiny, not debt. It doesn't come with invisible emotional invoices. It doesn't ask for your soul in return. You don't wake up wondering how you'll sustain it. You wake up knowing it was always yours. This isn't compensation, this is confirmation. Isn't it different when what you carry matches what you're walking into? The surroundings around you are shifting too. Environments that once drained your life force are being replaced by spaces that amplify your peace. You're walking into atmospheres that don't require you to negotiate your existence. This isn't relocation, it's resonant habitat restructuring. Your soul has become the compass, not your calendar. Isaiah 32:18 declares, "My people will live in peaceful dwelling places, in secure homes, in undisturbed places of rest." That is the architecture of your new season, secure, undisturbed, divinely assigned. You're entering a time where ease and excellence walk together, not as opposites, but as partners. You no longer equate stress with significance. You've shed the trauma bond with burnout. You're learning the rhythm of holy excellence, where grace becomes the gravity that holds it all together. You are no longer the underdog. That label was always a lie. It was written by systems that needed you to stay small. But heaven never saw you that way. Heaven saw blueprint, not background. Heaven saw assignment, not appearance. You're not a project to be fixed. You're a pillar, structural, essential, rooted. You're not a struggler looking for scraps. You're a steward managing overflow. You're not asking for a seat at the table. You are the table being prepared in the presence of those who doubted. Psalm 23:5 comes alive. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. And when people, some of whom once dismissed you, begin to ask how it all happened, you won't give them a link or a formula. You won't have a brand strategy or a 5-step funnel. You'll simply say, I stayed when it was hard, I walked when it didn't make sense, and I never let bitterness kill the promise. Just like Eliora, a sculptor who spent decades carving abstract sacred forms in a coastal village no gallery would visit. For years, her work was dismissed as too spiritual for modern taste. But she kept creating, not for praise, but because the vision burned in her bones. One day, a European cathedral curator stumbled upon her studio while lost on a hiking trail. Within a year, her work became the centerpiece of a global exhibition on sacred resilience. She didn't market herself. She became what couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, Bernie Madoff, once considered a genius in finance, ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history. He gained wealth, access, and admiration, but built it all on deception. When the collapse came, it didn't just destroy billions in savings, it devastated lives. His legacy? A warning that brilliance without integrity is a house made of smoke. You, on the other hand, became fireproof in the furnace of delay. You didn't just survive disappointment, you refused to make it your identity, and that refusal became the gate heaven now opens for you. Could it be that excellence was always your DNA, and now the world is finally catching up to your rhythm? You're not standing because you were promoted, you're standing because you were proven. When heaven called you a pillar, it wasn't a compliment, it was a designation. Pillars don't move, they don't flinch, they carry weight. They hold up entire rooms while still remaining grounded. In ancient architecture, load-bearing pillars were only entrusted to stone that had survived intense refining, chiseling, and pressurized aging. That's you, not ornamental, foundational. You were processed for permanence. 1 Peter 2:5 declares, "You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house." You weren't born to be a temporary fixture. You were designed as a load bearer in divine infrastructure. People may not always see your strength, but they're standing because of it. Could it be that all along you were never overlooked, just positioned too deeply for shallow eyes to see? And you're not just a steward of money or moments. You're a steward of meaning, of spiritual texture, of emotional legacy. You carry stories in your silence, hope in your posture, legacy in your laughter. You're not performing for blessings. You've become a sanctuary that blessings want to dwell in. That's why you no longer over-explain. You've graduated from justifying your glow. You're not defending the doors that opened. You're simply walking through them. Because when the oil is real, it doesn't ask for permission to shine. It simply flows. A young man named Ruel, a deaf woodworker in a quiet mountain town, spent his youth carving prayer benches for abandoned chapels. No one bought them, no one asked for them, but he kept making them, each one etched with silent intercession. Decades later, an architect restoring sacred ruins found his work in a storage shed. Today, Ruel's benches are installed in dozens of pilgrimage sites across Europe. He never sold his gift. He sowed it, and harvest found him. This is the kind of harvest you're entering, one that recognizes what you protected in obscurity. Isn't it strange how the world always catches up late to what heaven crowned early? You're no longer asking, will they believe in me? You're asking, can I stay true even when they notice? Because fame isn't the goal. Fidelity is, and your consistency is your credibility. You've proven that you don't need applause to sustain presence. You just need conviction. That's what makes you unshakable now. You're not surviving off adrenaline anymore. You're being stabilized by spiritual homeostasis, an internal balance between fire and focus, flow and structure. This is mature peace. This is overflow with roots. Isaiah 33:6 captures this perfectly. He will be the sure foundation for your times, a rich store of salvation and wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the key to this treasure. And you have become the storehouse. What you carry is no longer fragile, it's anchored. And the beauty, you never had to fight for it with manipulation. You held your peace, and heaven fought for you. That's wealth, not just in numbers but in knowing, not in balance sheets but in soul balance. It's waking up without dread because nothing is misaligned between who you are and what you carry. It's that holy exhale that tells your nervous system, you're safe, you're seen, you're sourced. True wealth isn't what sits in your hands, it's what sits in your spirit, even when everything else is in flux. It's the divine confidence that tells you, even if nothing changes on paper, everything's already been sealed in heaven. Proverbs 10:22 reminds us, The blessing of the Lord brings wealth without painful toil for it. That doesn't mean absence of effort, it means absence of torment. What you're stepping into now doesn't strain your soul. It supports your design. So stand up taller, not from pride, but from placement. Speak slower, not because you're unsure, but because you're anchored. Feel the gravity of this moment, not as pressure, but as permission. Because you're not hustling for scraps anymore, you're hosting abundance, the kind that rearranges the room when you walk in, not with noise, but with presence. Isn't it stunning that the very energy that once made people overlook you is now what's making them listen? You're not begging to be seen. You're being positioned to be honored. You're not surviving the margins of someone else's story. You're stepping into the headline heaven already wrote for you. Psalm 84:11 says, "For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord bestows favor and honor. No good thing does he withhold from those whose walk is blameless." You've walked blameless not because you were perfect, but because you stayed pure in intent. And heaven remembers that. You're not just being paid to exist. You're being celebrated for enduring without becoming bitter. You didn't let betrayal turn you toxic. You didn't let rejection reshape your reverence. You didn't let scarcity steal your softness. You're being elevated for choosing the hidden, holy roads, for letting integrity matter more than impression, for valuing depth over display. That's what wealth is. Not what you gathered, but what you refused to let go of when it was hardest to hold. Let me tell you about Marcellus, a janitor at a New England university who mentored fatherless boys between classes and graveyard shifts. He never posted, he never pitched, he simply showed up. Today, a leadership institute bears his name, not because he chased legacy, but because he lived one. What the world overlooked, heaven archived. In contrast, Carlos Ghosn, once hailed as one of the most powerful CEOs in the global auto industry, rose to the top through strategy, visibility, and control. But his empire came crashing down when accusations of embezzlement, tax evasion, and hidden compensation exposed the rot beneath the surface. He didn't just lose position, he lost credibility. The narrative shifted from icon to fugitive, because no matter how high a person climbs, if character isn't the scaffolding, collapse is inevitable. You, on the other hand, built slow. You let pain purify instead of poison. You let obscurity shape what applause could never teach. You let surrender become your strategy. And that's why what's coming won't crush you. You were tempered for the wait. Because this isn't about elevation for its own sake. It's about spiritual legitimacy. When heaven crowns you, no man-made hierarchy can undo it. That's why your posture now isn't arrogance. It's alignment. Your peace doesn't come from control, it flows from covenant. Isn't it strange how you don't have to push your way in when heaven has already pulled the chair out for you? You're not responding to culture, you're revealing kingdom. You're not reacting to systems, you're restoring design. You're not filling roles, you're fulfilling prophecy. Psalm 75, 6-7 reminds us, "No one from the east or the west or from the desert can exalt themselves. It is God who judges. He brings one down, he exalts another." And now the exaltation is real, because the foundation is righteous. You are not lucky, you are not trending, you are rooted. And the rooted don't chase seasons, they become the season. You're walking with the weight of answered intercession. You are the manifestation of what your ancestors prayed in silence. You are the continuity of vision across generations. And now the page has turned, not just for you, but for your whole bloodline. This is not just wealth. This is not just favor. This is heaven's legal acknowledgement of your obedience. So let the crown settle. Let the oil flow. Let the doors remain open. Because what heaven opened, no man can shut. God's chosen one, this wealth is not just arriving to you, it's arriving through you. This isn't about stacking comfort, it's about stewarding consequence. Heaven isn't funding your life just so you can rest. It's investing in you so others can rise. God never releases abundance without purpose. What's coming to you is part of a spiritual supply chain. Your increase is designed to become someone else's rescue. This is not selfish prosperity, it's sacred provision. The wealth flowing to you now carries assignment, not indulgence. Because when God blesses the chosen, He blesses their shadow too. Your territory is about to become refuge. Your overflow is about to irrigate dry places far beyond your original reach. The riches you're stepping into were never meant to stop with you. They're meant to move through you. That means your influence won't be measured by visibility, but by how far the ripple travels. Someone you'll never meet may eat from a table your obedience built. Just like Joseph stored grain not for himself, but for a famine that hadn't arrived yet, you're carrying answers for a need that's still forming. 2 Corinthians 9:8 declares, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work." That's not accumulation, that's activation. Blessing is not the end goal, it's the beginning of responsibility. Heaven doesn't just fill you to full, it fills you to flow. You are now being positioned as a kingdom distribution center, heaven's logistics hub for healing, liberation, and systems change. What if this overflow is not about what you keep, but what you carry forward? The blessing isn't meant to sit in your account. It's meant to be translated into assignments, atmospheres, and access. God didn't raise you to be a collector. He raised you to be a conduit. You're not just a recipient, you're a river. You weren't blessed to sit, you were blessed to build, and what you build now will outlive the applause. What you pour now will awaken dormant destinies in people who don't even know your name yet. A river doesn't ask who's downstream, it simply flows. The more it pours, the more life forms around it. That's your new design. You're not here to impress, you're here to irrigate. Genesis 12:2 speaks it clearly. "I will bless you, and you will be a blessing." This is covenant, not capitalism. Mission, not materialism. Capitalism accumulates for status. Covenant distributes for purpose. The riches that are coming carry instructions. They were formed to serve not just your comfort, but the kingdom's unfolding blueprint. You are now part of heaven's infrastructure. That's why the pressure was so intense before this breakthrough, because God wasn't just preparing your hands to receive, He was preparing your character to distribute. This is wealth as trusteeship, not trophy. Pressure purifies motives. When God trusts you with overflow, He must first trust that your heart is safe for others to drink from. That's why you were stretched in private, so you'd never exploit what He releases in public. Could it be that God is blessing you because your legacy will bless cities? Legacy isn't a biography, it's a blueprint others can walk on. Your story, your scars, your survival, they're not just memories, they're maps. When your legacy touches cities, it's not because you shouted louder, but because you surrendered deeper. You've endured poverty, not just of income, but of impact. For years you felt invisible, not because you lacked value, but because the system had no language for your kind of wealth. But now, heaven has authorized you not only to own, but to empower. Your impact was forming in silence. Every unnoticed seed is now erupting into legacy. You're not just someone who endured, you're someone who now embodies the antidote for a generation. Proverbs 13:22 whispers generational clarity. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. But this isn't just about land or stocks. It's about wisdom, atmosphere, justice, equity, safety. Your children's children may never see your tears, but they will walk in the provision your tears unlocked. That's how heaven thinks, not in decades, but in dynasties. Mackenzie Scott, philanthropist and author, has given away over $14 billion to causes aligned with human dignity, without requiring publicity or compliance. She isn't trying to be the face of change. She's funding space for others to become it. That's a picture of quiet power, using wealth to unchain people instead of obligating them. When your giving has no hooks, no pride, no proof required, you've graduated into divine economics. In contrast, Pablo Escobar, one of the richest and deadliest drug lords in history, used his billions not to liberate, but to control. He built entire neighborhoods and then used them as leverage to own the people inside. His wealth outpaced his wisdom, and in the end, he died hunted, isolated, and erased from every system he once ruled. Because money without mission leads to manipulation, he built cities on fear, not faith, and empires built on fear will always eat themselves. You're not Escobar, you're Esther. You're not gathering for power, you're gathering for purpose. Esther didn't use her favor to be safe. She used it to make others safe. You're not being enriched to feel important. You're being positioned to rewrite decrees. Meet Liam, a formerly incarcerated man in Detroit who learned to code while serving time. When he was released, he didn't build an app to get rich. He built a program that teaches youth with incarcerated parents how to write their first line of code. He now employs 18 former inmates, none of whom have reoffended. His wealth? It's the stability he created in others. He didn't escape his past, he redeemed it. Liam is proof that restoration isn't about erasing the wound, but converting it into wisdom. And now that wisdom pays salaries. Deuteronomy 8:18 says, "But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant." This is covenant confirming wealth, not just to buy, but to build something no storm can sweep away. Covenant doesn't fade in recession. It doesn't tremble with inflation. Covenant wealth is eternal in intention. It creates impact that outlasts markets and platforms. Are you ready to fund freedom instead of just your comfort? Because comfort may sustain you, but freedom will transform others. This question separates consumers from catalysts, and you weren't chosen to consume. You were chosen to create corridors of liberty. Because what's being released is not a reward for survival. It's heaven's seed bank, placed in your hands for the harvest of nations. And the question now is no longer, will it come? The question is, can it move through you clean? Because God doesn't just release to hearts, He releases through systems, and you've become one. So let it in, fully, humbly, and without resistance. Let the wealth flow through you, not because you're trying to impress the world, but because God is using you to impact it. Let the support surround you, not because you demanded to be seen, but because heaven knows you're safe to carry influence. Let the recognition rest on your shoulders, not as proof of performance, but as evidence of obedience. You don't need to perform to be trusted. You don't need to strive to be chosen. You simply need to stay available. Because when God says it's time, even the gates you stopped praying for begin to swing open. Not by force, but by favor. This isn't just your harvest, it's a movement, it's a generational echo, and it begins with one yes, yours. If this message resonated with your spirit, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another word of prophetic encouragement and spiritual alignment. I also invite you to leave a comment below. Type 777 if you're ready to receive wealth, not just for you, but through you. To every single person who's supported this message, whether through your presence, your prayers, your shares, or even your super thanks, please know you are seen, you are valued, and your seed is sacred. Even if you never gave $1, your engagement, your amen, your quiet agreement in the Spirit, it matters. And I'm deeply grateful. I speak blessing over you now. May the gates remain open. May your hands be trusted with more than enough. May your name be called in rooms you didn't campaign to enter, and may your wealth be both a sign and a stream, not just of provision, but of purpose. You are chosen, you are ready, and the nations are about to feel what God just released through you. I'll see you in the next video. Your journey's just beginning.